Back on. There we go. All right, I'm going to share my screen here. All right, can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Then you started from the beginning.
Okay.
So this is ADA's reentry program. It's entitled Justice, Release, Reentry, and Reintegration. Next slide, please. So this is the Alliance of Disabilities Advocacy Reentry Program, and it's a picture of myself and another one of our consumers actually signing his home plan and his paperwork to get long-term accessible housing. Next slide, please. So who is ADA? So Alliance of Disability Advocates is a Center for Independent Living, or CIL for short, and we're located in Raleigh, North Carolina. A Center for Independent Living is a federally funded organization that specializes in giving free services and resources to individuals that have any disability, the elderly, and of course, veterans. The Alliance of Disability Advocates has a catchment area of 8 counties. So we serve Wake, Durham, Johnson, Orange, Franklin. I know it's going to be pronounced Beaufort, but I say Buford, Pitt, and Wilson. Next slide, please. So for those who don't know, the requirements of a CIL are pretty much universal, no matter where you are. So in order to be a Center for Independent Living, there are certain requirements and regulations that must be followed. So 51% of the staff must have a disability. 51% of the board of directors must have a disability. All programs and services are consumer or client controlled. The Alliance of Disability Advocates does not require any medical documentation or proof of having a disability in order for consumers or our clients to obtain services or resources. The client or consumer must self-identify with having a disability, but are not required to divulge the nature of the disability if they choose not to. Next slide, please. So these are the 5 core services that are mandated from every single CIL. The first one is going to be information and referral services, and that's provided to all individuals who contact ADA in accessible formats. We have to perform independent living skills trainings, and essentially what that is helping an individual either maintain their independence or to increase their independence. That does not have to require the removing of any kind of clothing. We offer peer support, which includes cross-disability peer support, and CILs are able to offer that because, like in the previous slide, 51% of the staff have to have a disability. We have to do individual and systemic advocacy. So as an individual, we empower all of our consumers to be self-advocates, because who is better to speak up for an individual's rights other than the individual that actually needs it? And on a systemic level, because we are federally funded, we do receive legislation information prior to the general public. And if it does not necessarily meet the requirements of the CIL, then we will boycott and advocate. All CILs are also required to do transitional services. So that can either be for the youth or where I sit at, which is transitions from an institution, and diversion, which is keeping consumers out of a facility-based care. Next slide, please. So this is why we do reentry at ADA. While many people with disabilities already face barriers to employment, stable housing, and other necessary elements of economic security, adding a criminal record into the mix can pose additional obstacles that can make living with a disability an even greater challenge. Meanwhile, pre- and post-release reentry programs for formerly incarcerated individuals often lack necessary accommodations and connections to community services making the whole screen is just blocked off, Monique. You just blocked me off. After incapable, thank you. At making them incapable of meeting the needs of participants with disabilities. Next slide, please. So this is our expertise in reentry. So ADA has a history of providing reentry transitional services since 2016. This IRP, or individualized reentry plan model, was first tested at Butner FCI, which is a federal prison in Butner, North Carolina. So 212 people in Butner have benefited from this ADA reentry IRP services, with many of these justice-involved individuals being released to the Triangle area and continuing with their post-release reentry services. Of all the individuals enrolled in ADA reentry program at Butner, that's 212, only 2 have reoffended and returned in the first 2 years of release. That gives the program a 98% success rate. It was this IRP model that attracted, it's this IRP model that attracted the North Carolina Council on Developmental Disabilities to ADA. The North Carolina Council on Developmental Disabilities awarded ADA a 3-year grant to perform this model in 13 state prisons in North Carolina in 2020. Under this grant, ADA Reentry served 242 individuals with an intellectual or a developmental delay and had an 89% success rate of keeping individuals out of prison for the 3 years that we were running that grant. Currently, ADA now works with the Department of Mental Health to continue serving the IDD population, and we have now included the traumatic brain injury population as well. Next slide, please. So this is what we did during COVID. The COVID-19 pandemic has forced many organizations and programs to adapt in order to remain successful and viable. And ADA Reentry is no different. During COVID-19, ADA Reentry assisted individuals that were fortunate enough for conditional release from prison. Now, I say fortunate very loosely because for those who don't know, the conditional release from prison was if anyone was deemed medically frail, then they just released them without any home plan. The majority of them being released homeless without any kind of resources in the community. Jeez. So this pretty much, so the main issue, like I alluded to, was the majority of these individuals were being released with no home plan, essentially making them homeless. With CARES funding, ADA Reentry was able to support these individuals, addressing the immediate need of temporary housing and addressing the long-term need of permanent housing. This program at that time was so successful that Spectrum News did a story about the program. And I'm going to allow you to actually see that actual newscast now.
Maybe.
Hopefully.
Maybe not. Oh. Something went south. What happened?
Monique got it. She has to share the screen. You unmute, Monique.
Okay, just bear with me here, guys. I had it up and then it's not allowing me to click on it like it did before.
May have to hit Control and click on it, and you may also have to share the sound.
Okay, it's making me verify the link. That is so strange. Okay, here we go.
Uh-huh.
All right, can everybody see my screen?
Part of it.
Perfect.
Mr. King, step right in.
Garland King Jr. recently finished serving 12 years in prison.
Here's one from the White House from Bill Clinton.
His lifelong work with notable politicians and religious leaders faded into the background back in 2008.
In defense of my daughter, I had an unplanned, spontaneous confrontation with a volatile and violent son-in-law.
King was charged with second-degree attempted murder at the age of 65.
After my terrible misfortune, the reversal of all my fortunes, here we are.
While in prison, he lost his wife and his home. Now at 77, he's left to pick up the pieces.
You are a God-sent agency of compassion and benevolence.
But he's not alone. Sharif Brown is the manager of the Prison Reentry Program, an initiative to pair the formerly incarcerated with what they need to begin a new chapter.
We have to address this issue now instead of just releasing these justice-involved individuals into the streets with no resources because their only option is going to be to reoffend and go back.
Through state grants, Sharif and his team start working with the incarcerated more than a year before their scheduled release.
We go in when we can go in, and we meet with the justice-involved individual on a one-on-one basis.
Since they can't access prisons through the pandemic, they've changed gears to assist newly released people.
We can talk about technology, we can talk about mock job interviews, we can talk about LLCs for individuals that want to start their own businesses.
The stories Sharif hears ring close to home. His brother spent nearly 20 years in and out of prison.
He spent about 4 years there, came out, reoffended, went to Attica State Prison for about 10 years, came out, reoffended, and went back to Sing Sing for about another 5 years.
Sharif says his story would be different if he had more guidance after his first time behind bars.
They'll give you basic generic information that might not necessarily meet the needs or the requirements for your reentry, but they met their requirement by giving you this information.
He says in his work, he uses the same passion as if he's helping his own brother.
That's the story that he did on us on Spectrum. And yes, I do have a brother that did 20 years of incarceration, which is why reentry for me is so personal. Next slide, please. So this is the importance of an individualized reentry plan. ADA implements the independent living philosophy with all of the services that we offer. And this is vital with reentry as well. Transitioning back into community life from any incarceration is challenging. This challenge increases in difficulty exponentially as the time of incarceration increases and the availability or knowledge of resources decreases. It's simply not enough to offer blanket-style reentry resources to individuals pending release from incarceration. The ratio of case managers or social workers in prison to individuals being released requesting reentry services is an average of 45-to-1. Case managers and social workers in the prison system are overworked with a large caseload, which often leads to blanket or generic information given to these individuals, which at times is usually outdated and may not apply or address the needs of the individual. Once the individual is released with no viable resources or positive supports, that individual will most likely reoffend and return to prison, which goes against the foundation of beliefs of ADA. Next slide, please. So this is why successful reentry plans are so vital. Despite the occasional success story of a formerly an inmate, or I should say incarcerated individual, building a successful life, research continues to show that as many as 75% of justice-involved individuals find themselves back in the criminal justice system within the first year. Successful performance management of reentry programs and other resources are critical to change those outcomes. At the end of the day, successful reentry is important for both individuals and the communities. Next slide, please. So this is how the IRP process, or individualized plan process, works. The IRP, which stands for Individualized Reentry Plan, begins at the initial face-to-face meeting with the justice-involved individual. ADA recognizes that successful reentry doesn't start the day someone is released from prison or jail. The best outcomes occur when there are preparation and supports before, during, and after release. The most important facet of the IRP is listening to the individual when it comes to reentry as far as what they think they need to be successful and not return to prison. This approach allows anxieties about reentry to be expressed. ADA will sit down with them, listen to their story, ask about their goals. Empowering individuals to make decisions in their reentry now gives them a voice, which is something they lost as soon as incarceration began. They are no longer a number or just another face during count. Empowering individuals shows that ADA is invested in their plan for success. There is no such thing as a one-size-fits-all, which is why ADA Reentry offers a commitment to individualized reentry plan. So in practice, this might mean matching them with a therapeutic approach that appeals to their individual needs and wants. It can mean providing a range of educational and vocational opportunities, or it can mean integrating the client back with family to help create a more supportive and successful home environment. Programs and strategies that are built on this framework targets resources to those offenders who are at a higher risk of reoffending and provides individualized services to address barriers that each consumer may be expecting or experiencing. Once the IRP is constructed, it is hand-delivered to the individual and discussed at the prison to facilitate and support our consumers with a successful reentry plan. Next slide, please. So these are some of the resources that are involved with an IRP. Now, keep in mind, every IRP is going to be individualized, so everybody's not always going to want the same things, but this is what we're experiencing universally across every single IRP that we do construct. So obviously, housing opportunities and information is always going to be vital. That's one of the main barriers when it comes to reentry. Employment assistance and helping individuals with interview prep training. At ADA, we have something called Successful. So we have a closet that are filled with business casual clothing for men that are cleaned and dry and hand pressed and ready to go. And we actually distribute those items of clothing to our post-release consumers to help facilitate the barrier that they might have when it comes to having proper attire when it comes to going to a job interview. We link individuals to food pantries. We link individuals to benefits assistance and counseling. So essentially what that is trying to balance that seesaw of work and maybe a SSI check. We obviously do independent living skills trainings. We offer free individualized GED training and testing through Duke University. We link them to behavioral or mental health resource information. We link them to peer recovery support services and mentoring. We link them to information about vital records, which is paramount when it comes to obtaining an ID. So birth certificates and social security cards. If they are released in our catchment area, we are able to surround them with our post-release wraparound services. We link them to SNAP or food stamps information, Medicaid information, and of course, for the majority of the individuals that are incarcerated and have a drug or alcohol addiction, we're able to link them to AA and to NA therapy resources. Next slide, please. So recognizing that we can't solve every single problem, we do reach out to other agencies to collaborate because successful reentry is a multifaceted problem, and there's no single program that can address all the needs at every stage of the process. The range of challenges that lead to individuals returning to incarceration can include barriers to employment, housing, lack of family support, lack of problem-solving skills, unresolved emotional and mental health conditions, substance abuse recovery, isolation, and the lack of community integration, as many others. So we partnered with the Dunn Rotary Club of North Carolina. As I alluded to earlier, we have a partnership with Duke University, and their master's degree level students offer free individualized virtual or in-person GED training and testing, in addition to the Duke Occupational Therapy students reviewing the data and making sure that the program is effective. We have a partnership with the Women's Club of Charlotte, and they have joined in supporting the Reentry Suit Closet by donating business casual women's clothing. We are linked to multiple LRCs in Wake, Durham, Wilson, Franklin, and Orange County. We are connected to federal and state probation and parole. We're linked to SWIT, which stands for Success While in Transition, which is another nonprofit that was actually started by another formerly justice-involved individual. We are linked to the DD Council. We're linked to Monarch and to FTI 360. And both of those, they are one of the most highly recognized employment agencies in North Carolina. Next slide, please. So the stats on reentry and intellectual or developmental delay. Now, these are DPS, or used to be called DPS, now they're called DAC, but these are their numbers, not mine. So according to that, to NC DPS or DAC, only 55% of inmates with an intellectual disability diagnosis actually have an aftercare plan developed prior to leaving the prison system. Now, we at ADA assume that there are so many more with IDD who are not identified or diagnosed based upon this language. With a recidivism rate of 47% for all justice-involved individuals within the first 13 months of release, the likelihood of successful transition to a productive community life for an incarcerated individual with IDD is extremely low without proper planning, training, and supports. Next slide, please. So these are just some numbers and some things about the individuals that are incarcerated that have a disability. So according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, people behind bars in state and federal prisons are nearly 3 times as likely to report having a disability as non-incarcerated population. Cognitive disabilities such as Down syndrome, autism, dementia, intellectual disabilities, and learning disorders are among the most commonly reported. Justice-involved individuals are 4 times more likely to report a cognitive disability than the general population. People with mental health conditions comprise a large proportion of those behind bars as well. The Bureau of Justice Statistics reports that 1 in 5 justice-involved individuals have a severe mental illness. Next slide, please. So these are just more statistics when it comes to the population and the legal system. So the percent of people in the state prisons who have a disability, over 40%. Of the women in state prisons, over 50%. The percent of people on probation or parole who have a disability, more than 23%. The fraction of people killed by law enforcement who have a disability is 1/3 to 1/2 of every shooting. The percent of which children with disabilities are more likely to be arrested in elementary school, thanks to the school to prison pipeline, is over 400%. The percent of people in state prisons with a history of taking special education classes, more than 25%. The percent of correctional facilities that do not offer any special education classes is almost half. And the percent of court systems that list mental disability on their websites as a basis for special accommodations, especially when it comes to sentencing,
in a meeting.
is going to be 30%. Next slide, please. I know it's a very, very long acronym. Pretty much what that stands for is the North Carolina Department of Mental Health, Severe Mental Illness and Substance Use, Intellectual Disabilities, Traumatic Brain Injury, and of course, ADA. So ADA Reentry was able to partner with the Department of Mental Health to continue this initiative after the grant for the DD Council expired. This is a 2-year grant that will serve both traumatic brain injury and intellectual or developmentally delayed justice-involved individuals in the counties of Wake, Durham, Johnson, Franklin, Orange, Pitt, Beaufort or Beaufort, and Wilson, with post-release resources and provide pre-release resources to individuals in 14 different state prisons. So ADA, we have recently secured a $1.75 million grant from the Department of Mental Health to expand the program and offer state-of-the-art transitional funding for individuals that will include assistance with security deposits, rental assistance, clothes, cell phones, food, bus passes to assist individuals with their transition and supporting those individuals already in society with a more holistic support approach. Next slide, please. So to date, ADA Reentry has served over 600 individuals with a 90% success rate of keeping individuals from reoffending as long as they are enrolled in the program. Next slide, please. Now, I'll put this slide in because a lot of times when I make presentations about the program, unfortunately, the only thing that people are really concerned about is money. So, according to a 2022 report from NC Health, housing one incarcerated individual for 1 year costs the state of North Carolina taxpayers $50,000 per person. So programs like ADA Reentry that have a proven record of having high success rates in assisting with successful reentry continues to save the state money, which lowers taxes for all individuals living in North Carolina. So you take that $50,000 a year and you multiply it by the 600 individuals that we assisted, we saved North Carolina a lot of money. Now, with all of that success, I know you guys probably think that the team is voluminous and we have 30 or 40 people working in this program. Next slide, please. There's only two of us, myself and my community inclusion specialist / certified peer support specialist, Mr. Wayne Bell. So we're only doing this with two people, believe it or not. Next slide, please. Now, that's all about the program, but this is really the crux of why I'm here. Because a lot of individuals have no idea why prisons were even started, what prison is even about, or the detriment that it does to any population, but especially the African-American population. So the picture there essentially is the pre-industrial complex, and that is a breakdown in a picture of everything that the society benefits, or the reason why. Plantation, you see the sweatshops, you see individuals loading boxes, and obviously the Department of Corrections is slave labor, unfortunately. Next slide, please. So, from slave to criminal with one amendment. Of course, that's the 13th Amendment that I'm talking about. And if you guys don't know what the 13th Amendment is or what it entails, you will after this, I promise you. Next slide, please. So this is how it all started. In the year 1865 marked the end of the Civil War and the passage of the 13th Amendment. It also triggered the nation's first prison boom when the number of Black Americans arrested and incarcerated surged. This was the result of state governments reacting to two powerful social forces. First, public anxiety and fear about crime stemming from the newly freed Black Americans, and second, economic depression resulting from the war and the loss of free supply of labor. State and local leaders in the South used the criminal justice system to both pacify the public's fear and bolster the depressed economy. All across the South, Black codes were passed that outlawed and made criminal behaviors common to Black people, such as walking without a purpose, or walking at night, or hunting on Sundays, or settling on public or private land. Now, if you guys don't know what walking without a purpose is, that's just walking around. And that was deemed a crime for African Americans at that point. Southern law enforcement agencies targeted Black people and aggressively enforced these laws and funneled greater numbers of African Americans into the state punishment systems. Next slide, please. So this is the 13th Amendment loophole for African Americans. The loophole contained within the 13th Amendment with abolish slavery and indentured servitude except as punishment for a crime paved the way for Southern states to use convict leasing, prison farms, and chain gangs as legal means to continue white control over Black people and to secure their labor at no or little cost. Very few white men and women were ever sent to work under these arrangements. By assigning Black people to work in the fields and on government works, the state-sanctioned punishment of Black people was visible to the public, while white punishment was obscured behind prison walls. By many accounts, conditions under the convict leasing system were harsher than they had been during slavery, as these private companies no longer had an ownership interest in the longevity of their laborers, who can easily be replaced at a low cost by the state. Although the incarcerated people subject to this treatment sought redress from the courts, they found little relief. Time and time again, the courts approved of this use of convict labor, confirming the Virginia Supreme Court's declaration in 1871 that an incarcerated person was, in effect, a slave of the state. Next slide, please. So this is the prison farming / convict leasing, and it's a picture of probably every single African American in the fields working. So in 1870s, prison farms and convict leasing was started. This was a tool used by society to benefit from cheap labor and work on the farmlands of the South that was left unattended to after the slaves were freed. Almost 100% of the individuals that were incarcerated during this time were African Americans. Next slide, please. Rebuilding the South using slave prison labor. State penal authorities deployed these imprisoned people to help rebuild the South. They rented out convicted people to private companies through a system of convict leasing and put incarcerated individuals to work on, for example, prison farms to produce agricultural products in the reconstructed South. These were physically attractive strategies given the effect of the Civil War and the economic depression that followed it. Convict leasing programs that operated through an external supervision model in which incarcerated people were supervised entirely by a private company that was paying the state for their labor, turned a state cost into a much needed profit and enabled states to take penal custody of people without the need to build prisons in which to house them. Next slide, please. So the birth of the chain gang, economic, political, and industrial changes in the United States contributed to the end of private convict leasing in practice by 1928. However, other forms of slavery-like labor practices emerged. State prison authorities introduced the chain gang, which was a brutal form of forced labor in which incarcerated people toiled on public works such as building roads or clearing land. Chain gangs existed until the 1940s. As with convict leasing before it, those sentenced to serve on chain gangs were predominantly Black. Prison farms will also continue to dominate the Southern landscape during this period. In 1928, Texas was operating 12 state prison farms and nearly 100% of the workers on them were Black. During this time frame between 1926 and 1940, the prison population experienced an increase of 67%. Next slide, please. Now recognize that this is not just going on in the South. So from 1910 to 1970, 6 million Americans, African Americans, moved to the North in what was called the Great Migration. 1900 through 1950, the dominant white class connects criminality to three classes: the African Americans, immigrants, and lower white classes. The racial disparity in prison begins to double. In 1940, the correctional institution model that you see today now emerges in the North, but all of the rehabilitation services and resources were reserved strictly for white inmates. And between the years of 1964 and 1972, both President Johnson and Nixon determined that civil rights activism is now considered a street crime. Next slide, please. So as much as people don't want to think that it's a matter of Black and white, unfortunately it is when it comes to prison. So only 13% of the American population is Black. Keep that in mind. Only 13% of the American population in whole is Black. But more than 60% of the people in prison are now racial and ethnic minorities. Nearly 1 in every 3 African American males aged between the 20 and 29 is under some form of criminal justice supervision, whether imprisoned, on parole, or on probation. For Black males in their 30s, 1 in every 10 is in prison or jail on any given day. Several studies, including one by the Justice Policy Institute, which advocates alternatives to incarceration, have concluded that overall, more Black males are in prison than are enrolled in colleges and universities. The leading cause of incarceration of an African American male is petty nonviolent drug offense. About 14 million whites and 2.6 million African Americans report using an illicit drug. 5 times as many whites are using drugs as African Americans, yet African Americans are sent to prison for drug offenses at 10 times the rates as whites. African Americans serve virtually as much time in prison for a drug offense, which is roughly 59 months, as whites do for a violent crime, which is roughly 62 months. Next slide, please. So Black men are in prison at a rate of 6.5 times higher than white men. The incarceration boom fundamentally altered the transition of adulthood for several generations of Black men, and to a lesser extent, still significant, Black women and Latino men and women. By the turn of the 21st century, Black men born in the 1960s were more likely to have gone to prison than have completed college or any kind of military service. Next slide, please. So this is ethnicity and incarceration stats. 1 out of every 3 African-American boys born today can expect to be sentenced to prison, compared to 1 out of every 6 Latino, compared to 1 out of every 17 white boys. 32% of the US population, like I alluded to earlier, is represented by African Americans and Hispanics, compared to the 56% of the US incarcerated population being represented by African Americans and Hispanics. If African Americans and Hispanics were incarcerated at the same rates as whites, prison and jail populations would decline by almost 40%. 35% of the individuals executed under the death penalty within the last 40 years have been Black. African Americans only represent 13% of the general population. African Americans are pursued, convicted, and sent to death at a disproportionately higher rate than any other race. Next slide, please. So this is just a graph that I'll put up just to show you the disparity between the population in America compared to the population that's actually incarcerated when it comes to Black and whites. And this is as recent as 2019. So the numbers are probably even greater than that at this point. Next slide, please. So in closing, inequitable treatment of African Americans and non-whites has its roots in the correctional errors that came before it, each one building on the last and leading to the prison landscape that we see today. Next slide, please. So this is where we are. We're at 3725 National Drive in Raleigh. We are probably right down the block from Crabtree Valley Mall. And that's our phone number, 833-1117. If anybody wants to contact me directly, my number's at the bottom, 919-591-0891. And of course, that's the website information and our email at the bottom. Next slide, please. So I thank you all for listening, and I am more than open and available to any questions that anyone might have. And my apologies, my son with autism wants to make his appearance, so I'm trying to keep him off the camera. But I thank you guys for paying attention and listening to what we're doing at ADA as far as reentry goes. And obviously, I hope you guys got a little bit of history about why prisons were actually created and what they were really created for, and recognizing that this social and this racial inequity and this disparity still continues to this day right now.
Thank you so much, Sharif. This was very, very powerful. And I'm just speechless. This was amazing. Does anybody have any questions for Sharif? If you raise your hand, put it in the chat.
I saw
Or
some in
come
the
off of
chat.
mute. I'm sorry, what'd you say, Corey?
I said I saw some in the chat throughout while Sharif was speaking.
Okay, let's
Let's
see.
see.
And I'm sorry, y'all, when he was presenting, if I clicked on anything at the bottom, click checking the chat or anything, these little gray boxes were blocking his view. So I couldn't keep up with all the questions. So let me go through here and see. All right, so we have a question. Let's see, how long do they offer supports from Crystal? How long does ADA offer these supports?
Right. So the pre-release, the way that we have it set up right now is that fundamentally we would love to work with someone 6 months before they get released from prison. Now, obviously, if they're released to our catchment area, as in every single program that any SIL runs, it's consumer controlled. So on the post-release side, there is no end date to us dismissing someone from the program. Once that individual that is receiving our post-release services feels like they no longer need our support and they can do it on their own, then we then dismiss them from the program. But it's at their call and at their discretion. So there is no end game or no timetable for us, unlike most other reentry programs that might say you have 90 days and that's all we can give you. We have some people that have been receiving post-release services for 2 years now. So it's completely up to that individual.
Okay, and I think I missed one from Pat. She said, is or when will these programs be offered in the West? And is it being offered in our state female prisons such as Swannanoa? Also, what about our youth prisons?
Yeah, so the first answer to the question, will it be available in the West? We would love to take over the entire state. That's the end game, is to have this model copied. We're actually in conversations with DMH right now to work on a standardization of the program. So essentially, it's a how-to that we're going to essentially have in a binder that we can give and disperse to any organization, and it doesn't even have to be a SIL. Any organization that wants to mimic and copy this initiative and this program, we're laying it all out on how to do it. Now, I've been in conversations with other SILs for years, trying to get them to mimic and to copy this program. But as you can probably imagine, reentry is very ugly. And a lot of agencies don't want to touch it for a lot of different reasons. And you have to have the personality and the actual staff that is not afraid to actually go into a facility. And sometimes that's not the situation. So as of right now, from what I know, we're the only SIL in America that's doing pre and post release for individuals specifically with IDD and traumatic brain injury. So, what was the second part of that question? I'm sorry.
It was 3 parts. So the second part was about female prisons and youth prisons.
Yeah, so as long as there is a need for us to go into female prisons, then we do. This is not just a program only for men. We also are taking care of females as well once we get those referrals from the Department of Adult Corrections. Now, we are in conversations with juvenile justice to try to get in and do the same program there. The only difference with individuals that are in state prisons and juvenile justice is that sometimes the sentences are a lot smaller. So the turnover in juvenile justice is faster. So sometimes we're not going to have enough time to actually work with an individual in juvenile justice before they are released and being released to a county that we don't necessarily serve. But ideally, we would love to get with juvenile justice first, because if we can get them there, then chances are they don't even make it to state prison.
I know years ago, we had a place not too far from here in Burke County. It was the High Rise. I actually worked there at one time. And, you know, there were 1,000 youth or more in that facility, and it was 16 stories high. Some of them were there for many, many years. But, you know, I saw where you talk about the older populations being released too and the challenges they face. Well, one of the things I witnessed at the High Rise that was the saddest thing to me was you would have children come on visitation day to see their teenage fathers, and some of them were maybe 20, and the little kids would say, "I can't wait till I get big enough to come here." They wanted to come there and be a prisoner. It was like other kids wanted to go to the beach or be on vacation type situation. So, you know, got somehow to change that mindset to where young people that are going to visit their parents in prison don't want to be like them and end up in prison is one of my big concerns. But I do also know that the LME MCOs and stuff, part of, especially if they have a mental health diagnosis, probably, you know, that would include your TBI and your IDD folks too. You know, they have a certain amount of time, a lot of times, to visit, to check in and go to an appointment. And your mental health, there's like kind of like a scorecard type thing. And if these folks that are getting out of prison don't check into their appointment when they're supposed to, then it's kind of a black mark on the other organization that they didn't show up for their appointment. So I believe there are probably a lot of people across the state in a lot of good places that would support this program, or at least take a good look at it, because it is so needed. I mean, I know that some of the mental health workers are going out to drumming circles and parks, and they're trying to get in and go in before they get released to build some type of relationship with them so they will keep these appointments when they get out.
Absolutely. So what you're talking about as far as children coming and seeing their parents, that's called generational incarceration. And unfortunately, the majority of individuals that experience that, believe it or not, are African Americans, because in the urban area, it's the cool thing to do to go to prison. They consider it a rite of passage. to where you get more respect going to prison than you do going to college. So yeah, we have to rewire people's mentality and their thinking about the prison system and about the detriment that it does to any race. But absolutely, there's no question. And unfortunately, when there is a missing father figure in the home and having children so young, and the only thing they see is their father in prison, they think that that's the right thing to do as far as what they have to do for themselves. And unfortunately, a lot of times in that family structure, there's not support to divert that youth from that track. So unfortunately, a lot of times, and I've seen this firsthand, a lot of times there will be the father and the son incarcerated in the same facility.
You may
So-
even have that and a grandchild. I've seen it too. So, you know,
Yeah.
we need to change that. However,
Absolutely. Absolutely. I thank you for the questions, though. I definitely appreciate that.
Okay, let's see, we have a question from Claire Jess. She said, can you speak more about the speak more to the independent living skills trainings when it comes to this?
Sure. So essentially, as in everything, it all depends on the individual. So for just the one that always pops in my mind all the time is always going to be about employment. So a lot of individuals that are incarcerated either have never had a legal job, they've never been on a job interview, they have no idea how to write resumes or cover letters or anything else like that, or they've never seen a cell phone before. They have no idea how to ride the bus where they are once they do get released. So these are all the things that we can actually teach them on paper prior to them getting released to kind of lower that anxiety, because getting released, there are so many things anxiety-wise that they have to deal with. And if they've been incarcerated for 15, 20 years, the environment that they're expecting to see is not the environment that they're seeing once they get out. Everything is different. Everything has changed. Everything has either evolved or not. And sometimes for a lot of these individuals, especially when it comes to technology, they have no idea how to manipulate things like that. So we're able to teach any kind of an independent living skill that they might need, that we're able to teach on paper, because we can't bring any kind of technology into prison at all for anything. Yeah, we can't. So if I'm teaching someone how to ride a bus, it has to be on paper. If I'm teaching someone how to use a cell phone, it has to be on paper, because legally we cannot bring any technology into prison.
Yeah, we have about
another
3 more
thing-
minutes. Hold on, Pat. We have about 3 more minutes, and we have a few more questions to get to.
It's keeping them alive when they get out. The first couple of weeks, there is a high number of deaths among
From overdoses, absolutely.
folks that are being released.
Mhm.
Absolutely.
Okay, so do you have any advice about going into mental health court to address a charge? That's from Cody.
As far as going into mental health court, one, obviously just make sure that you have all of the documentation when it comes to doctors and everything else like that, because a lot of times individuals don't have that documentation on hand, and most mental health courts are not going to take word of mouth situations. So make sure you have all of that lined up, and just be prepared to advocate, because it's going to be a fight. No matter what, it's going to be a fight, because unfortunately society's first recourse to dealing with somebody that has a mental health is to lock them away from society. And that goes back, way back to years ago when disabilities first came along the scenes, where everybody was deemed retarded. So, that just goes back to them. So just be prepared to advocate, and make sure you have all your documentation ready to go.
Okay, and ask, when did you implement this program, and when are the milestones available?
I implemented this program in 2016. That's when I first started this program at Button Federal Compound. And as far as the milestones that we have, that's obviously we have that within the agency. So if you actually want to see the actual milestones that we've successfully completed, I can always send that to you. That's not a problem.
Okay, and one last question, 1 more minute. Is this specific to prison, from Daniel? One issue we have in our county jail is that our reentry specialist doesn't know when individuals are getting out unless they're already convicted, which makes it hard to provide these supports.
And that's exactly correct, because in county jail, you can go in one day and you can bond out the next day, which is why we only really want to deal with state and federal prisons, because we know that that individual isn't going anywhere. for a certain amount of time. So we have enough time to go in and actually work on their individualized reentry plan without having to worry about them bonding out the very next day and then us losing complete contact with them.
Wow. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Sharif. This was truly incredible. And we have a survey that's going to populate after we end the Lunch and Learn. And Sharif, he put his email in the chat. And I'm also going to send a follow-up email to everyone with the link to the replay, Sharif's contact information, yeah, and everything. Will we have a copy of the presentation or no? Just want to make sure so people know what to expect in the follow-up.
Yeah, if people want the actual PowerPoint, that's fine. I have no problem with that. Just email me and let me know that you want the actual PowerPoint, and I have no problem sending it. It's not an issue.
Fantastic. Thank you again, Sharif. Thank you all for attending, and I hope you all have a wonderfully blessed week. And we'll see you next
Appreciate
week.
you guys.